coming to get you, Barbara.
I ain't one to make a fuss about a thing like that.
Make your wishes.
They're coming for you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Deep Cuts of Horror, the horror podcast that cuts deeper. I'm Dylan, and I'm joined again by my co-host, Jacob. And today, Jacob, what movie are we talking about?
The Ninth Configuration in 1980.
Oh my gosh, yes, this movie. But before we continue, we just want to remind you guys to make sure you subscribe, follow, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and if you could, go ahead and follow us on our socials at Deep Horror Pod on both Twitter and Instagram, now that we have an Instagram. And you can also email us at deepcutsofhorror@gmail.com. With that out of the way, Jacob, what were your thoughts before you watched this movie? Maybe we should talk about that a little bit. What were your notions going into the film?
So, a little side story here. Dylan, you watched this movie.
Me.
That's Dylan. That's my, yes.
Hi.
You watched this movie several days before I did.
Mm-hmm.
And you text me, I can already hear your review, Jacob. Is this really a horror movie? And so when I read that, I was determined that I was not going to say that about this movie, because I remembered that I had said that about 2 or 3 movies already. Mm-hmm. So I was going into this determined. I was going to say, okay, no, this is a horror movie. This is going to be a horror movie, right? Well, I'm going to have to say it again. And it's not just me being pedantic. I think it's actually important, like, to the narrative of this story to recognize that it's probably not really meant to be a horror movie. So that was my thought going into it, was fierce determination to be scared. And then what I got instead, I'm still turning around in my head.
Yeah, and I didn't know anything about the movie either. It was on a couple lists, and I saw it was categorized as a horror movie. After watching it the first time, I had to go back and make sure I was looking at the right Ninth Configuration. And on multiple sites, it was listed as a horror movie. And in fact, I watched this movie on Shudder, an exclusive horror movie streaming service. So you think you'd be safe. However, some things are questionable, but on the second viewing, the horror is very much cerebral and not in a visual sense at all. If you put yourself in the context of these characters and what they're experiencing, that is a legitimate horror, but unfortunately it's not a visual horror or really something you can express in a medium properly without using a lot of metaphorical imagery.
It's an existential horror.
Yes.
And not in the sense of Lovecraft, which is usually what you'll reference with existential horror. It's more of a moral and philosophical existential horror, where it kind of asks you, what does it mean to be alive? And, is there a God? Is there life after death? That sort of thing. Which, now that you mention it, I think was conveyed pretty well as the characters kind of wear down and get more desperate. You really do start to get that terror leaking through. But I would say that's maybe the last third of the film, that it's more of a horror movie.
Well, I will say this for the movie, it's kind of all over the place. I'll give the creative team this. They swung for the fences in making this movie. You can tell, especially with a lot of movies that are made now, there's a lot of focus groups and there's like bullet point notes of what people want to see in a movie, and they have to hit those notes every time. This movie really does not care about that. They know what they have, and they just swing for the fences, and whatever hits, and whatever doesn't. And I can commend that. I haven't really seen a movie that didn't care like that. Or maybe not care isn't a good term. I haven't seen a movie in a long time that knew what it wanted to be, and was so... I don't even have words for it.
So, it's not that the movie doesn't care in the sense that it doesn't, care if it's a good movie or not. It's a movie that doesn't care what you think of it.
Right.
It just does what it wants to do, which is really, I guess, not categorizable into any particular genre. First of all, this is based on a book that the director himself wrote. Did you know that?
Yes.
Okay.
Perhaps we should get into a little bit. This movie is, believe it or not, a sequel to The Exorcist, for anyone listening. And I can explain that context a little bit from my research. So I'll go ahead and preface this by saying I haven't read the book The Exorcist, but I have seen the movie, like a lot of horror fans have. And even if you haven't seen The Exorcist, you'll kind of get the context of the film if you know anything about The Exorcist. There is a scene in the movie where the little girl Reagan is already sick. They're not really 100% sure what's wrong with her yet. They haven't officially said that it's a possession, but a lot of weird stuff has happened. Anyway, the mother, who's an actress, is hosting a party while the little girl is upstairs asleep. And these strange things have been going on. There's a lot of people there. The mother's an actress, so she has a lot of high-profile people at this party. One of which actually is, I believe, the priest who helps perform the exorcism later in the movie. The main girl, Reagan, comes down, and she's speaking to the group, and she says, "You're gonna die up there." Now, in the movie, it's implied that that phrase is just directed at the group, and on a rewatch, spoiler alert for The Exorcist, probably want to skip about a minute. The priest is the one that dies in the end of the movie, so it's a bit of foreshadowing for you. But in the book, she says it at the group, but mainly directed at one of the party members, who is a character in this film, Cutshaw, because he's about to go into space. So when she says, "You're gonna die up there," that's directed at him because he's about to go to the moon. And that's the connection to the story.
That is very interesting. When you said, you're going to die up there, of course, Cutshaw is immediately the character that I thought of, but is that the only connection between the two of them? Is it more of just like a reference to a previous work, or?
Yes. That's the only connection. And again, it worked in the movie because then they didn't have his character in the movie or even the actor in the movie. And it just works on the level of whatever's inside of Reagan telling them they're going to die up there if they try to stop her. But in the book, it works for Cutshaw, who is afraid of being alone and dying alone in space. Can
you imagine what the reaction would have been if they did include that in the movie and then somebody watches the Ninth Configuration? Because, these movies are just so otherwise dissimilar, tonally at least. To have that one little thread.
Can you think of a movie and its sequel that are that different? I just want to say, between The Exorcist, which is, regardless of my opinion, the scariest movie ever made. But as far as critically speaking and generally known, people say it's the scariest movie ever made. I don't believe so, but again, personal mileage varies. This follow-up, The Ninth Configuration, I don't want to say it's definitely not good. It's just a lot of things. It's a comedy, it's a drama. There are some there's some spooky imagery for sure, but I wouldn't 100% say it's a horror movie. I think whenever they made this movie, they didn't know what it was either, and the critics didn't know what it was, which led to this movie being as divisive and also as unsuccessful as it ultimately became, and why we're talking about it today on a podcast about deep cuts of horror. Trademark.
So, first of all, I think it's a bit disingenuous to call it a sequel. Just because there is a single character that connects the two films doesn't really make it a sequel. Like, it would barely even be a spin-off by modern terms, right? Like, if you have a main character from one IP or one work, whatever, and then now that main character becomes the lead character in another show, we don't call that a sequel, we call that a spin-off, and they were still a main character. Just because there was like a random guy named Cutshaw in The Exorcist and now we have the Ninth Configuration, I wouldn't call that a sequel. Would you really call it a sequel?
What if I told you this was the second in a trilogy?
I would say that I probably don't think it's a trilogy, but I want to know what the third movie is.
The third movie is based on the third book in this creator's series called Legion, which was later adapted into The Exorcist 3.
All right.
For those confused, there is an Exorcist 2, Exorcist II: The Heretic, but it's not based off any pre-existing work of The Exorcist.
Regarding what you were saying about the genre, so I have not read either of these books that we're talking about. I've not read The Exorcist, and I've not read The Ninth Configuration, but I did see that one of the previous releases of either the movie or the book or both, and let me know if you know for sure, was originally titled Twinkle Twinkle Killer Kane. And
Both.
yes, both?
Both.
Okay.
Both. I
And-
think the book was originally adapted from a short story, and the author just expounded upon the work.
And as I said, I have not read them, but from this movie and from what I've seen about the Ninth Configuration, I would probably like to place it more tonally in line with something like Good Omens or The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in terms of this sort of like slapstick, absurdist, philosophical musings, right? I mean, that's really the tone that I got from most of the movie. Well, how did you feel about that?
Interestingly enough, you say about the tone, I think you also have to look at it from the tone of now and the tone of today. A lot of the comedy is derived from a lot of what these characters who are people who have suffered a mental break are considered to be insane persons. In fact, the vast majority of my notes here are all just quotes that I just loved because especially on the second viewing, I got to pay attention to a lot more of the background stuff, and I have a lot of quotes written down that are just hilarious. However, in a movie that would be made today, the focal point of the joke probably wouldn't be the quote-unquote insane persons involved. Just because tonally nowadays that's not 100% PC, and there's some stuff in this movie that really isn't PC at all. But
Well, I think that there... Sorry, go ahead.
oh no, I was just gonna say on the second viewing I found myself enjoying it a lot more versus the mad confusion that I had the first time, and just wondering, oh, Jacob's probably gonna kill me for this.
Oh, yeah, jury's out on whether I kill you for this, but if I do, I'll be doing it happily.
Well, just know this will be in the court docs.
I'm glad that I saw this.
If it means a jury of 12 people have to listen to 9 hours of our podcast, that'll be worth it.
We'll keep that in mind, right? The very last episode will be me explaining how I killed you.
There you go.
That will be the finale of Deep Cuts of Horror. Okay, so I think that there's an interesting conversation to be had about the concept of madness in literature and in film in general, because like you said, there is, I don't know if we want to call it a stigma necessarily around like mental illness and consequently the way that it's portrayed in film, where you have somebody who, you look at some of the characters in this film like Cutshaw and the way that they behave, and somebody might look at that and say that's offensive, that's that is not an accurate portrayal of mental illness and that sort of thing. And if the movie were intending to accurately portray mental illness, I think those criticisms would be justified, because I don't want these illnesses misrepresented or stigmatized. But separate from that, there is just a concept of madness. It exists in horror, it exists in fantasy and in science fiction and all that is not a classifiable mental illness and is just more of a breaking of sanity that is no more real, I guess, to our world than any of the myriad fantasy diseases that you might concoct. And I think that recognizing that the tone of this film is not necessarily intended to be a serious, grim, dark horror is important, because you're not meant to take this insanity seriously, right? It's silliness in the same way that Monty Python is silly, right? You don't look at like a Monty Python sketch and go, that is an inaccurate portrayal of craziness.
But you would also be doing yourself an injustice as a viewer to think that this is 100% a comedy as well. Or really, I wouldn't even say it's like a comedy horror movie. It's just a mix of a bunch of things, and when it wants to be that thing, it is in that moment that thing. And then it switches gears again. I'd say first half of the movie is more comedy, and the second half is, you could say, psychological drama.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. And it uses the platform of these supposedly insane characters to have discussions on screen that most movies could not possibly have. I mean, you flexed on me with your little yellow notebook there with all of the quotes and stuff you wrote down. And yes, that was something that struck me immediately when I watched this film. Is there are dozens and dozens of amazing quotes, but they're so hard to remember because they're so absolutely ridiculous. Like
they have no context. There's no context because
and
it's
context
just
doesn't even help.
Insane. Well, yeah, it's usually just the patients of the asylum just saying stuff in passing, like "et tu, white thing."
The man on the moon tried to fuck my sister. Was one of them that I remembered. If God exists, he's a fake, or like
a foot,
or more likely a foot. Yes,
and then for the rest of the movie,
foot.
And then for the rest of the movie, Cutshaw refers to God as a foot. He says things like, "Would foot be upset with what I'm wearing?"
But you intersperse that with all of these kind of legitimately inspiring quotes about, madness doesn't, like, evil doesn't come from madness, madness comes from evil, and things like that, where you kind of have, it's like you're sticking your hand in a bowl full of just absolutely nothing, and just confusing, crazy nonsense, and then every once in a while there's just this nice gem, and it's so hard to tell the difference.
It really is like a game of what am I tasting, where you're blindfolded and they just, put different spoons of stuff in your mouth, like one of it's hot sauce, one's cookie dough, one's just straight up vinegar.
Like, okay, look at this one real quick. Can you prove there's a foot? Asks Captain Cutshaw. There are some arguments from reason, replies Colonel Kane. And then Cutshaw says, are those the things we use to justify dropping atomic bombs on Japan?
Here's the thing, too. A lot of the dialogue in this movie is very dreamlike. I know we've used the term dreamlike a lot here, but this dialogue, a lot of it does sound like dialogue you would hear in your dream, and it makes perfect sense. But then you wake up and you replay back your dream in your head, and it made no sense whatsoever.
But there is, like, an underlying meaning to it where the words don't make any sense, but you watch the conversation and you understand the ideas that are being exchanged.
Sort of like if you watch a foreign film without subtitles. You just get the context based on the tone and desperation in the scene.
That is exactly the example that I was going to give up. Or if you yourself are, like, semi-fluent in a foreign language, but you can't speak it. You're just watching two people talk, and you don't know what they're saying, but you understand it. That's what happens a lot in this film with this crazy discussions that they're having, and yet underneath it, you can tell something's going on.
Mm-hmm. I will say, one of the things that drew me to pick this movie for the show was just because it had a kick-ass 1980s poster.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. The one with the biker guy on it?
No, mine was it had Killer Kane in the forefront, and he was behind the castle, which we should probably also talk about. We should probably, before we get too far into the conversation here, talk about what this movie is about.
Yeah.
Let me pull up. Pretty much, I'm not looking at anything here. Pretty much this movie is about a psychologist who, probably not 100% right themselves, goes to this asylum that is meant for people just coming out of facing some sort of active duty and they've had a mental break. In the beginning of the movie, they discuss in a narration that people have had emotional and mental breaks around the time of the Vietnam War. It was a bit of a phenomenon then. And whether they were faking it or whether it was 100% true. That's what they're there to study, and also how to help them. So we have a psychologist who comes to this castle to help these people, but there might not be something right with him either. And that's pretty much the plot. Through the whole movie, you kind of get if they were to make a remake of this in the 90s, I'm sure Robin Williams might play the psychologist Kane, where he just has a lot of conversations with these people and understanding their mental disorders and not really dismissing them, but sort of playing into them constructively. One thing about, and I just want to get that out of the way, because on this poster, the little tagline for it says, "The Killer Kane Cure." It's unorthodox, it's unauthorized, but always effective. So, spoiler alert, if you haven't watched a movie, go ahead and watch it now, but I'm going to spoil it here. Does that tagline mean he kills himself often?
Always effective.
Always
definitely
effective.
Implies that it's happened more than once.
If you're having
Yes.
an issue, if you're in the psychology profession and you're helping people who are mentally unwell, try killing yourself. It's always effective. That will help them. Please don't put that on me. But
That's probably why that profession has such a high suicide rate. Too many people have watched this movie.
well, yeah, because it's the only way to break through to them. No.
I think that one of the reasons this film had an identity crisis is because The Exorcist was so famous. And so it kind of got shoehorned into being marketed as a horror movie, even though that's not really appropriate. Like, I feel like if this movie were just made independently and nobody knew what The Exorcist was, that poster would look completely different and that tagline would be completely different. What do you think?
I'm about to say something that I know is 100% fact. That's going to make this conversation even more weird.
Okay.
The creator of The Exorcist has said on multiple occasions he gets angry when they consider the movie a horror movie, because he doesn't see it as a horror movie.
What does he see it as?
It's a story about a family having a trial of faith. It's more of an, I don't want to say an endurance movie, or an endurance story, but it's more of the evils of the systems in place in the Catholic Church that won't help this family through what they're going through, which is a lot of the movie. It's really more of a Catholic procedural, because all the time this girl's having these issues, and the Catholic Church doesn't see fit to perform an exorcism, and it's a lot of the priest who's trying to help her, trying to figure out how to navigate the situation and go about getting her what she needs.
I don't think that confuses the discussion any. I think that it just warrants a larger discussion about what exactly a horror movie is. And maybe that's something we would want to consider for a future episode. I think there's definitely, intentionally or otherwise, a sort of understanding that a horror movie is a bunch of college students in the woods getting their limbs hacked off after they bare their breasts. And so when you have something that sort of touches on really deep concepts like social injustices or the morality of existence, then it makes a lot of people hesitant to call it a horror movie because they don't want to be kind of reductive about it.
Yeah. And that's one big takeaway I've always wanted for this show, sort of like a mini thesis. Horror isn't always somebody with a knife just hacking up a lot of horny teens. At the end of the day, it's more cathartic than that. Sure, people watch horror for the wrong reason sometimes, and the gore and the campy acting is always fun set dressing. But at the end of the day, it's about facing this obstacle and overcoming it. There's a monster under the bed. It's about humans seeing the monster under the bed and destroying it or taking away its power so it doesn't exist anymore. And that speaks to, I know this is probably a bit more of an elevated topic, but come on, it's the ninth configuration. Let's do it. humans for all of mankind have been coming up with stories to have this sort of catharsis where they both explain and remove power from the things that scare them or the things they're unable to face. And that's one of the reasons a lot of people like superhero and Marvel movies now, I would say, is it's putting yourself in the place of this main character who's a superhero and defeating this unstoppable, just trademark evil. Only with horror movies, you just have the regular everyday person who is faced against this supervillain type character who has either super abilities or super strength or some sort of upper hand. And somehow they're able to defeat them just by putting their wits together, just being there at the right place and right time.
Though I agree with basically all of that. I would say that to me, if I wanted to try to classify what something needs to be in order to be horror, or maybe even you can look at it from the reverse perspective, like what should horror be? It's bringing the audience, by virtue of bringing the characters, face to face with an unsavory and, I guess for lack of a better word, terrifying aspect of reality. You know, to me, you mentioned Marvel films. No matter what villain that Thor is fighting, or whatever villain Iron Man is fighting, within reason, it's not going to be something that is equivocable to something that the everyday person is going to face. But when you bring a character into confrontation with their own doubts about existence and about the meaning of life, for example, or to a crisis of faith, or to a realization of some like corrupt aspect of their government, some type of conspiracy, anything like that could be or is real, and they have to deal with it in a real way. To me, that's horror, and that's what horror should be. And yeah, I mean, if you want to just have people running around in the woods getting stabbed, that's fine too. Go for it. But I feel like maybe it would be more appropriate to call that just a slasher, and to have horror be this encompassing genre of bringing people, like you said, into confrontation with some obstacle like that. I think that that's a good definition of what the genre could be.
I agree, and it's so funny that the two genres that are so unalike are really so alike when you think about it. Like, the two I'm thinking of are horror and comedy. They're so different in their nature, and they evoke very different responses in humans, but fundamentally they're very much the same. They both have just these endless subcategories of what they are. And mileage varies for each one. With comedy, you have, slapstick comedy, stand-up comedy, raunch comedy, college humor comedy, family comedy, just musical comedy. I mean, hell. And pretty much the same thing applies for horror movie. Every type of horror movie you can think of, there's a subgenre for that, whether it be slasher, ghost story, monster film. And they both also serve that same purpose of being a method of catharsis for dealing with things.
Have you, by any chance, watched Steven Universe?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember when Garnet just stares directly at the camera and says, "All comedy is derived from fear"?
Yes, I remember that now.
That is the quote that I am reminded of when we're having this discussion, because I don't want to be cliche. I know this is something that's been said over and over again, but it's true. If you think about a majority of things that people find funny, they are on some level responses to trauma.
Yeah.
Right? Like when you watch somebody slip on a banana peel. Firstly, I mean, a lot of people are not going to consider that funny anymore because it's overdone. Seinfeld isn't funny effect. But still, like, that is one of your quintessential comedic situations. And you're watching somebody break their back. Mm-hmm. Like, that's a horrible thing. Even things that we consider to be relatively innocent humor, like awful puns, generally the humor from awful puns is not derived from the fact that they are themselves funny, but the fact that they are awful. Yes. And that you are subjecting the people that hear them to the misery of your voice. Mm-hmm. So I think that there is a very closely connected relationship between comedy and horror, or comedy and tragedy, to the point where they might even be the exact same thing. It depends on how you respond to them.
Yeah.
What?
Nothing, just hearing you typing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear that? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
No, it's just funny.
Okay. But I was looking up the details of a story that I had heard recently, and you may want to cut this out, I don't know, but it reminded me of like the link between trauma and comedy. Bobby Lee was on a podcast telling a story, and he began the story by looking at the co-hosts and saying, "When I was 9, I was molested by a man with Down syndrome." And they burst into laughter, even though the story was ostensibly true, mm-hmm. because that was the only way they knew how to respond to that sentence being drawn out of the blue. Mm-hmm. And then every time he tried to tell that story, like for the next 3 or 4 times he opened his mouth, they would just die laughing.
Yeah, it's just crazy how humans respond to trauma in different ways and respond to trying to explain this and make sense of it in our brains. And that's probably as out there as it gets. Is it's just funny how we're just all a giant meat muscle that controls fingers and pain and happiness and sadness, and then we're also expected to work 40 hours. We as the meat muscle are expected to carry our carcass to a place to work 40 hours a week, making money that we also invented, because a bunch of other meat muscles that, on top of controlling blood flow and heartbeats, decided you need to make money.
Well, when we are told that God created man in his image, they never tell you that he started with the foot.
No, Jacob. No.
Our entire world is just a Quentin Tarantino movie.
It is. Okay. We should get back to the movie.
Oh, I think we're on the movie. I can't
on the movie. But oh gosh, this movie has us talking like the crazy people.
Oh, and I love it.
One thing about the movie, though, that I want to bring up, just kind of bring the conversation back into the film. The opening of the movie really sets the stage really well for what we're going to see the rest of it. You get this really hummable folk song that I've been looking for that you can't really find about San Antonio, that apparently Cutshaw's listening to in his room, while we get the explanation, not the explanation, we just get the visual of the spaceship and the moon. I just like that. And then we see the castle, which itself is a good representation of these people, because the castle just looks like it was built onto with a bunch of different fucking styles, which you could say is an allusion to the madness these people are facing, because even the inside is very chaotic. The inside of this castle is very chaotic. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of different art styles going on, posters up, scaffolding just sitting there like something needs to be replaced but isn't. It's just a very interesting setting that we have, and it's just always covered in fog.
Yeah, I mean, weirdly enough, given the conversation we just had, it is almost a quintessential setting for a horror movie, right? This enormous house or this enormous castle that's always been built onto or has different styles, and it's kind of falling into disrepair, like Winchester Mystery House, Rose Red, Haunting of Hill House style.
Yeah, and again, I want to say this movie being classified as a horror movie was mostly as a result of critics and people at the time having no idea what other category to put this into, because horror kind of is a dumping ground for everything that you don't know what it is.
That might say something about the human condition.
Yes. Yes, it does. Anything that you can't explain is terrifying and inherently evil. So it's horror. We should probably also talk about these men who are at this place. You definitely get all these really quotable lines out of these people and all these funny situations, like when Groper, who is the general over these people, I guess, or more of just an orderly. I love Groper. He gets them all to fall into attention, and then they all salute him with Hail Caesar.
The opening sequence to this movie, like all the way from Cutshaw's like visions of the moon, all the way to the arrival of Colonel Kane, is just such a mind fuck. Like, there's this almost like opening montage where all of the patients are just kind of walking out into the courtyard, and they're saying just all these sorts of crazy things, like, is that Superman? I know my rights. I want to talk to my urologist.
I know my rights. I want to talk to my urologist.
And then Groper is trying to give them commands, and they inform him that he didn't say Simon Says. Mm-hmm. And so he goes along with them as well, which is adorable. It's just, I didn't know what I was looking at for like the first 20 minutes of this film.
It really does sound like dream dialogue in this sequence, I will say.
And Groper as a character is, I think, just adorable. I mean, he's very poorly named to be working in an insane asylum, but the fact that he's such a serious-looking character, and the fact that he's so clearly fed up with everything that's going on here, you just feel sorry for him, and yet you get the impression that he really is trying.
Yes, and the only way to really help him is to just feed into that madness, I guess.
Allegedly.
From the moment we're introduced to Kane, or I should say Killer Kane, he is approached by, quote-unquote, Dr. Frome, who tells him about the patients and everything going on at the facility, and they're having this little walk-and-talk discussion, and then guards come up to seize him because he wasn't actually a doctor, and he says, "Get this man ready for surgery." And then the actual doctor, Dr. Fell, shows up in his underwear because Patient Frome stole his pants.
Which apparently is a regular occurrence.
Yes, and that's where we get the fun line, "I know my rights, I want to see my urologist." And they sing when they're in the Fallen line, they sing "You Are My Sunshine."
This entire facility seems remarkably disorganized for a secret government military asylum, I have to say. Firstly, where did they get all of the props that they have in this place? People are riding around with capes.
Where do all the dogs come from?
Yeah, they have a bunch of dogs. It's just like... and a bunch of easels. Like, I mean, maybe that's after Kane starts indulging them. I'm not sure, but this is a very disorderly place.
Mm-hmm. And there's a random picture of just Dracula hanging on the wall, which is funny because the castle kind of does look like Brahms' castle. It's just so funny. And then we kind of have their first night there, and it's kind of upsetting that one of the characters does this whole vaudeville sketch in blackface. So if that's not your thing, just be known that does happen in this movie. And I was given a little bit of a yikes.
It was the 1980s.
Like
literally the last
late to be doing that.
The last movie that I watched before this was Tropic Thunder.
Oh, I mean, yeah. To this day, I still don't know how Robert Downey Jr. And I'm not saying anything that I don't like Robert Downey Jr. I love the man. I just don't know how they pulled that off in 2009. Because even then, I remember that was something that you really didn't talk about or do. But somehow pulled it off. No.
First of all, they're making fun of the fact that he's doing it, which I think is a big part of it. And also, yeah, it was 2009, but the world was still really different then than it is now.
Oh, now's probably a good time to talk about...
racial politics.
Yes. No. Kane's interactions with these patients. We can start with the first one, who was Fairbanks, who we're introduced to as taking a hammer and just hitting the wall multiple times, because he has this idea that people can walk through walls, cops, doctors, people from Nashville, everybody. And he's striking the wall because he says he's punishing the Adams so the other Adams will let him pass.
Yeah.
I just love this scene.
So, I love this scene for several reasons. First of all, it's funny. But second of all, it shows that there is a clear line of logic that a lot of these patients are following in their madness. Now, we already talked about how this madness is not representative of real-world mental illnesses, but I find that in a lot of cases, this sort of madness is portrayed as just high-energy, intellectual rambling with no direction, right? People are just saying random shit for the sake of being silly. And there is a lot of that in this movie. And in my opinion, it's exhausting. It's tiring, and I don't like that. But there are also discussions that have clear, like, logic that you can follow, even though it's, like, not applicable to the real world. Like, it's obviously faulty logic. It's internally consistent.
Yes.
Like, this guy thinks that he can walk through walls. First of all, I love that he explains his methodology. He's like, first, I concentrated all of my will on, like, all the atoms in my body to separate them and have them file through the holes in the wall so that I could appear on the other side. When that didn't work, I just tried to walk through the wall. When that didn't work, I got a running start. That hurt. And now I'm punishing the wall by hitting it with a hammer, which itself is funny because he's not trying to hammer through the wall. He's just punishing the atoms in the wall to make an example out of them so that the other atoms will let him through next time because they don't want to get hammered. Like, this is all internally consistent with his worldview.
Yes. And Kane, being this psychologist, he does a good job of not trying to stop him from doing it, but to keep him from hurting himself, and also using that logic to get the desired result in the end. So
yes,
steering.
His method of dealing with the patients is very much, I will indulge in their insanity at least until the point that it's harmful, so that I can try to understand them, right? I'll play along and I'll figure out where they're coming from. And it really does seem to work.
And the movie does a good job, too, of you never know who's sane and who's not sane. And you never know who is insane and who's faking it, either. The quote-unquote straight man for the film, Dr. Fell, he's a little weird himself, considering he is running around in his underwear. Granted, it's because Frome keeps stealing his pants, but he's still running around in his underwear. And he makes a comment to Kane that he never drinks on the job, but in the next scene we see him talking on the phone about a program they're doing there. He like crushes up Tylenol or something and puts it in a bottle and then tops it off with Jim Beam and drinks it, and then has a conversation with the skull on his desk and says, "Don't blame me, I told them not to operate."
I think that Groper is maybe the only person in this film whose mental condition I did not speculate on. And I'm counting myself as an audience member. I mean, the entire time I was watching this, I was having to rededicate myself to believing that I was really watching this and that I hadn't fallen asleep.
Yes, it's another Carnival of Souls moment where you don't know if you've fallen asleep.
Only this time, in my opinion, the part where I kind of checked out was more toward the beginning. Because, my, there is like a straight hour that's just insanity.
that's what's funny too, because they already play off Kane as he's unstable. They play him off as unstable, and really everybody's just a bit kooky. And we get Cutshaw going into Kane, and he just starts messing up documents. And we have this quote also that I really love, where he's asking on whose... Kane asks, is just placating him, saying, on whose authority do you have these orders? And Cutshaw says, unseen forces too numerous to enumerate. I just love that, and I put a little star by it, because I'm probably going to use it in my day-to-day.
Could you give me an example of when you're going to use that?
When I have to remove someone... when I have to remove someone from where they're staying and they ask on whose authority am I acting, because they decided just start pelting people with oranges.
I think that's a very good example. I would love to hear about it when you do that.
Unseen forces too numerous to enumerate. And during this conversation, they have this little through bit where Cutshaw has Fritos in his back pocket, and every time he's just going all around the office talking to them and just sitting down, and every time he sits down you hear this little, like, of just the Fritos being crushed in his pocket.
This is almost a meta joke. Like when people will go on talk shows and leave their cell phone on just so that somebody calls them and it ruins the talk show. Like the fact that we as the audience are constantly being subjected to this awful chip crunching sound for no apparent reason is hilarious. And the first time it happens, he said, like, I believe the end of the world has come for the bag of Fritos in my back pocket.
And he keeps just sitting down and crushing him even more.
Yeah.
Cutshaw just eats the scenery in every scene he's in. It takes a lot of energy to play someone that manic and that supposedly insane. But he's also... I'd also say he's the one who has... I would argue isn't actually insane, just because whenever he does stuff, it doesn't really have a through line, like you mentioned.
There are a few instances where it does. And these are namely their conversations about God and good and evil and whatnot. Like, I think Cutshaw at one point says something along the lines of, I don't believe in God, but I believe in the devil because he keeps doing commercials. Or something like that.
Yeah. And then and it's in that same scene we get the man in the moon tried to fuck my sister.
Yeah, like, I would argue that even though we don't have as many of, like, these long conversations with a specific internal logic like we do with the Hamlet scene or the Hammer scene, almost everything that Cutshaw says is clearly rooted in some kind of a visible idea. Which I'm not really going to speculate on which one of the patients was or was not insane in air quotes, because I don't think that that's important ultimately to the movie. But yeah, I mean, Cutshaw clearly, I mean, we find out at the end that, you know, at the very least he's cured. So he either wasn't crazy in the first place or the Killer Kane method works like it always does.
Yeah, and we get... It's during that scene with Cutshaw, that first one, that we get... Okay, but we should probably talk about this. Did you initially suspect this little, I guess you want to call it a twist, that Kane was a patient as well?
Okay, so I suspected that he was not himself mentally well, although I would argue that that's pretty obvious. I did not expect that he was a patient, no. And I also did not expect that he was Killer Kane. And as of this recording, I think the most recent episode that has been released is Tenebrae. And we had a discussion in Tenebrae about the twist, or lack thereof, with Giuliano being the killer. Is that right?
Peter.
Giuliano is the guy with the voice.
Cristiano.
Cristiano?
Yes, Cristiano.
Okay,
You're getting Giarmani, the inspector, and Cristiano confused.
So, Cristiano. Well, we had a discussion about whether or not it was a twist that he was the killer, and I was talking about how obvious I thought it was.
That he was.
And you were talking about how you did not consider it. And I kind of feel like I'm in the reverse situation about Kane, because we're constantly having these kind of like basilisk in the walls type scenes where he's up late at night and he hears like this voice in his head, and we see these dream sequences where he has these like really horrifying dreams, and we learn that he supposedly has a dead brother who was a really effective guerrilla fighter in Vietnam. And literally never at any point did I consider that he might be his brother. Or that he might be a patient. Like, that just did not cross my mind at all. And I can't tell if I'm dumb for that not being the case.
I wouldn't say that, because this movie is a lot like that old computer game where you just have all the little squares and you're just supposed to pick a square and then all the numbers come up and then one of the squares is a bomb.
Minesweeper.
This movie is a lot like Minesweeper in that there's a bunch of just irrelevant things being said and going on that pinning down what is actual truth is hard until the movie's already over. But I will say, I kind of got the hint of what this movie was doing with Kane as the character, and it made me retroactively mad that I saw the movie Shutter Island and that Shutter Island did it better.
Ugh,
So I had
I've
to.
not seen Shutter Island.
You haven't seen Shutter Island? Oh, well,
No.
I'm so sorry.
Do you recommend it?
I do. I had to look up when the book Shutter Island was written to figure out who was copying from who. But then I also found out that in this movie they reference a work that also plays on this trope, which is funny. But throughout the movie, you have this through line of foreshadowing that this is going to happen. From Kane getting to the facility and Frome greeting him, and Frome being a crazy person who thinks he's a doctor, just the same as Kane does. And then you get a scene where Cutshaw is talking to the rest of them, and they say that Kane is as crazy as Kafka talking to a bedbug. Whatever that means, I just wrote it down because it was so off the wall.
I think it's a reference to Metamorphosis.
Yes.
That was Kafka, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think so. And Cutshaw also even tells Kane that he's a mental patient. And I'm sorry, I just keep coming back to that first scene because it's just so fucking good. He takes a book from Kane's office. Cutshaw does. And he's like, what are you taking? It's a book. What book is it? I Remember Mama by Oedipus Rex.
Which, do we know what book it actually was?
No.
Okay.
I just like that it's already explained that everybody in this facility is highly intelligent. But I Remember Mama by Oedipus Rex is a funny joke when you break it down. Maybe it's because it's just muddled by all of the other crazy nonsensical things that are being said in the movie. And you just get these, like, few barbs that you actually have to put some thought into. What does that even mean?
So, I mean, apart from the obvious, which is that Oedipus fucked his mother, could you break down the joke for me?
No, that's really just it.
Okay.
That's really just it. I like it. I mean, I was just ready to dismiss it until I saw it was Oedipus Rex, and I don't really know anything about I Remember Mama. I meant to look it up, but I didn't. It didn't make my notes. All I really did was just make sure that Shutter Island didn't come out before this. But we do have a conversation later where Cutshaw is talking to, I believe, Reno in a tree of all places. And they're talking about how Kane is crazy because it's just like the movie Spellbound with Gregory Peck, which I did look up, and the plot is kind of similar to that. It was directed by Alfred Hitchcock. It to my understanding, it does sort of play more on a romantic sort of story. And they even explain the plot as he came to take over the asylum when he, in fact, himself is a patient. So the whole time they've just foreshadowed this, and it's only really on a second viewing that you realize, oh shit, they know exactly what they're talking about.
I mean, it's a literal example of the inmates running the asylum, right? Mm-hmm. That idiom.
Yeah. Another patient I wanted to talk about was the character of Reno. Reno, the man who is directing dogs, adapting Shakespeare plays for dogs. I think he's probably my favorite character in this movie. Just because he has all these dogs and he's treating them like serious actors, and he's treating this other guy who's working with him, Spinell, like a shitty assistant.
Where is he getting the dogs?
Okay, the main dog we see throughout the movie, I had to watch it twice to figure out if it was an actual dog, because it just looks like a bunch of mop heads
yes,
that they're scooted together, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was just a Muppet. But to my knowledge, it was an actual dog. Though I'm still not 100% sure.
It looks like the dog from Labyrinth. What was its name?
Sir Didymus.
No,
Sir Didymus was the Lancelot.
I think
was it Lancelot?
No, that's the teddy bear.
Oh gosh.
Oh, I gotta look this up.
The Labyrinth fandom is gonna come for us.
Yeah. Ambrosius!
Ambrosius.
Yeah, Sir Didymus is the weird weasel knight thing that rides him.
I also love how Lieutenant Spinell is just trying to offer advice for how to adapt these things, and offering different breeds of dogs to play characters like Julius Caesar. And Reno just tells him, get the fuck out of here.
Well, I think it's because he was recommending a female dog.
Oh, yes, a female dog.
Yeah.
He was like, we'll just take a license. So we're adapting Shakespeare plays for dogs, but we're not going to have female dogs play male dog parts.
Which, by the way, when confronted about why he is adapting Shakespeare plays for dogs, his answer is because someone's got to do it. And he seems to be perhaps the most self-aware of all of the characters. I mean, he literally has a conversation with Cain about Hamlet's insanity being a method of protecting him from the horrors of reality so that he can make himself well. And like both he and Cain have this conversation like fully without acknowledging the fact that they're both talking about the plot of the movie.
Right, and that conversation about Hamlet, I did watch it twice just because, again, crazy ramblings and everything aside, there are a lot of good moments in there.
In that conversation specifically?
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, it's people who are mentally unwell, but they still have a thought process to them. And their whole conversation about Hamlet being... What was the context of it? Hamlet, they were talking about, the Shakespearean scholars talking about, was Hamlet really crazy or was he just pretending to be crazy? And ultimately they come to the decision that Hamlet was just pretending to be crazy, but he was on the brink. And I kind of think that's why Cutshaw isn't actually crazy. He's just on the brink and needing time to figure things out, because he seems relatively normal at the beginning of the movie when he's just in his room. Another thing I noted was we have these scenes that are intercut with Cain just sitting in his office doing random work and taking notes. And one of the books he had was Human Destiny by French name. It's Human Destiny by Lecomte Denoy.
I have no idea.
Just look up Human Destiny. Yeah, I mean, but basically it is a book about sort of a lot of the central themes of the movie here. Has human evolution evolved as far as it's going to? Is there a God? What is a soul? Really playing with those sorts of things, and I thought that was a really neat little Easter egg, and it's something I'd kind of be interested in reading probably, even though it came out in 1947. And it's here that he takes a note saying that shock treatment is curative, which is a bit of foreshadowing, but also a bit of a central theme to the story. We all know how shock treatment is administered in asylum-based stories, but they do it really interesting here in that it is an actual shock treatment. It's just a shock to the mental senses instead of an actual electrical stimulation.
Yeah, the entire solution to this asylum situation winds up being a pun. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, it's not literal shock treatment. It's like a shock to your worldview, a shock mm-hmm. to your understanding of things. Mm-hmm. Which, do we want to talk about what form that shock takes?
What do you think? You want to go into it?
I think we should probably try to do this in chronological order as best we can. To try to keep
it's a story about insane peoples. Yeah, but anyway, we have a really good conversation right here with Kutshagin and Cain, where they talk about the foot / God. As you're talking about, the devil exists because he's still in commercials. I just think it's so funny that Kutshaw just walks into the office and says, "Here, I brought you a mud pie." And then, because he's dressed like he's going to the beach, he has swim fins on his feet, and he's just slapping those things around, and he just sets sandcastle bucket on the table upside down and just lays it on the desk. And then they have this whole real existential conversation about, is there a God? But basically, this whole conversation with Kutshaw and Cain is just Kutshaw doesn't believe in God. Pretty much the whole thing, Cain is just talking to him and getting his perspective on faith in general. And this leads to Cain having a very strange dream. Which is probably, if nothing else, if you don't want to watch this whole movie, again, I'm not saying this is a movie I'm ever going to reach for in the month of October just to watch a scary movie, because this isn't it. It works on some intellectual levels, but this movie is a bit of a movie you have to masticate and chore through to finish and sort of get more of what they're going for. But we have this dream sequence, and you can find it on YouTube, and even if you don't like the movie, I would implore you to watch this scene, because it's actually pretty stunning, where we have the man on the moon, and we also have a voiceover from Cain who says, "In order for life to have appeared spontaneously on Earth, there first has to be hundreds of millions of protein molecules of the 9th configuration." And I just love movies that use the title of the film in them. But given the size of the planet Earth, do you know how long it would take for just one of these protein molecules to appear entirely by chance? And he says roughly 10 to the 243rd power billions of years. And I find that more fantastic than simply believing in a God. And it's at this scene we're just shown a man walking on the moon, and then he just starts bowing to Jesus crucified on the cross on the moon.
Very powerful imagery and a very good quote for the most part. I've personally never heard of the 9th configuration of proteins. Now, I'm certainly not a biochemist, but have you heard of that before?
I haven't, but at the same time I copied off you in biology.
Well, then I guess it makes sense that neither of us have heard of it.
Your knowledge is my knowledge, but to a lesser degree.
I have a really, I don't want to say a soft spot in my heart. It's not quite right. Something that's more akin to a hard-on, I guess. I don't know. I really love it when movies will have an obscure title that you really cannot figure out what on earth it's referring to, and it ultimately ends up referring to something obscure that is like tangentially related to the sort of the theme of the story. And I'm probably going to come up blank if you ask me to give examples right now, but the Ninth Configuration is one of them, where I give you the synopsis and I say, okay, we have a bunch of military inmates in an asylum, and we have a guy who's trying to cure them, and to see which ones are kind of actually crazy and which ones are just pretending toward the end of the Vietnam War. And I say, okay, well, what's the movie called? The Ninth Configuration. What does that mean?
It's a cool ass name.
Yeah, it's referring to proteins. To some, I love when movies and books and anything like that will do something like that. Or even if the title is kind of directly related, if it's so difficult to figure out just from reading it. You know, it's not like The Wizard of Oz or something where it's like, okay, well, that's what that's about. You know, like the three-body problem. I know I'm rambling a little bit, but I just really adore that because it transforms the work automatically into a puzzle. Because you don't only have to figure out what story is being told, but what the meaning of the story is.
Through the lens of the Ninth Configuration.
Now, as far as the actual, like, the meaning of the quote, with regards to the likelihood of life arising randomly and the meaning of, you know, believing purely in science versus in religion of some kind. I have to say, the magic of this discussion is mostly lost on me because I have seen way too many atheist versus creationist debates. And they are not nearly as magical as a man on the moon staring at a crucifixion.
But it is a really good visual representation of what this movie is. You're playing with science and mankind's hubris, which one could channel into also being a metaphor for America's politics in the Vietnam War. And then you just have straight up carnal, ritualistic crucifixion. Something that is so... Both are very much mankind, but both are very much mankind. Both are equal parts mankind at its worst and best. Actually,
I didn't realize that Pontius Pilate was actually a pilot.
yes.
And that he took the Jews to the moon to crucify Jesus.
What is that, like seventh tier Mormonism?
I don't know. I never got that far.
Yes, if you go, the moon is actually a paradise planet that hasn't been taken over yet. So the first Mormon to get to the moon, that's free real estate, baby. You can have all the wives over there.
I did just remember a couple of examples of that sort of title thing that I was talking about, though. And one of them is slightly pertinent to this movie. A Clockwork Orange. Like, if you've ever read or watched A Clockwork Orange, and then you think, like, why is it called A Clockwork Orange?
Or maybe
That's one of those...
or maybe you've mistaken the theatrical poster of this movie for A Clockwork Orange.
Yeah,
in which case
is
you're
valid.
welcome.
Because, I don't know, for some reason, like, the entire time I was looking at Cutshaw in this movie, he kept reminding me of Alex DeLarge. There's, like, something about the way he was dressed and the way he acted.
Well, you've seen the
Am I alone in
posters
that?
side by side, right?
No, but I'll take a look. And are we still referring to the poster that you were talking about?
No,
Or-
we're talking about the one you were.
Yeah, no, I've seen those, both of them, and yeah, they are very similar, which I think the biker gang leader looks really badass in that poster. Like, I really like it.
Yeah, the form and function about... Yeah, it's... I can see how you would accidentally watch both of these movies.
And Silence of the Lambs. That's
Yes.
another example of the title just being, like, really tangential to the plot, but really important to the theme.
Or Superman 4, The Quest for Peace.
No, I lack the knowledge to comment.
Yeah, it was just more of a joke.
The movie was a joke, or you bringing it up was a joke?
Both!
Okay.
Both. We're still mad about it. But it's toward the midway of the point where Dr. Fell and Dr. Kane are talking about a gentleman who's referred to colloquially as Killer Kane, who killed 30 to 40, probably more people during the Vietnam War for guerrilla tactics. He was a Marine, he just did his job to the best of his ability. And it's here that we learn that Killer Kane and Dr. Fell were real good friends. And it's also here that Kane discloses that Killer Kane was his brother and that he is dead. And Dr. Fell walks out of the room and he's actually really crying and heartbroken, which you can take as is, but later in the movie it makes a lot more sense why he's so upset, because I thought it was just kind of melodramatic the way he was doing it at that moment.
Yeah, so there's something about this entire situation that doesn't quite add up to me, and let me know what you think about it. But so the Colonel Kane, who is in charge of the asylum, claims that he has a brother, Killer Kane, who is now dead. And these are, of course, the same person. Colonel Kane is Killer Kane. He's just gone into denial about it. Dr. Fell claims that he used to know Killer Kane, that he'd met him and had drinks with him and stuff like that. Shouldn't that be an extraordinary red flag to Colonel Kane? Because Colonel Kane is in denial about the fact that he is Killer Kane, right? He's created the persona of his brother to, like, separate all of the murders that he has committed from himself. But somewhere, like, buried deep in his mind is still the understanding that he is, in fact, Killer Kane. And even if he has pushed it off on his imaginary brother, certainly he would think that his brother looked a lot like him, right? Okay, so if his imaginary brother looks a lot like him, and Dr. Fell is like, yeah, I used to have drinks with that guy. We were good friends. Shouldn't that be a red flag?
It's later we learn that Dr. Fell and him were actually childhood best friends.
Yes.
In fact, it's quoted as him and Fell were practically brothers. Were brothers. In the colloquial sense. So
I was trying to figure out if that was colloquial or literal, because they look nothing alike.
Yeah, I know it's colloquial. So I'm thinking that it's just whatever part of his brain Kane is just shut off from everyone else. But it is at this point that we do get a lot more of Kane sort of deteriorating from this persona. Now, this also happens directly after the dream that we just mentioned, where he's talking about the 9th configuration protein. And it's also cut with a scene of something happening in the war, presumably, that we find out later. So it's my assumption that all of this just kind of goes into this facade he has going on is deteriorating inside of himself, which leads us to the ultimate end.
Oh my gosh. So many of the movies that I have been reminded of during this movie have that same title plan. Like Colonel Kane. Every time I look at Colonel Kane in this movie, I think of Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men. Something about his face. They have similar faces. He does to Javier Bardem, and also his haircut, like being a little bit weird and not quite fitting his head.
Well, they also all implore the Kubrick stare.
Yeah.
And the method of, if you want to seem crazy on film, just don't blink. Which none of the 3 characters do. You won't see them just blink.
And that is yet another example of a movie with a title that has nothing to do with it. I love it. I love that. Sorry. I know I keep bringing this up. I just love that I'm thinking of examples spontaneously that are like somewhat related to the movie.
Oh yeah, you're going to do the thing where after this episode you just text me, damn it, I didn't mention this one. It's right on tip of the tongue.
There was still something that I forgot to mention in Horror Express that like we literally never talked about. Do you remember what it was?
No.
Oh, it was about the whole, the chalk.
The chalk? Where the fuck did they get the chalk?
No, not where did they get the chalk, but like, why did the whole chalk thing happen since, like, it wasn't actually religious, it was an alien. Right? Like, that made no sense in hindsight. You remember that?
Yeah.
It's like this random primordial alien has a problem with crosses made out of chalk.
So, since we did a 2.5-hour episode on it, I'm gonna make myself an official authority on Horror Express because someone's got to do it. In the words of Reno.
Yeah.
Aliens are a trick of the devil to trick good Christians. So if you believe in life on other planets, that's not true.
It's just another one of the devil's commercials.
Yes, it's another one of the devil's commercials.
All right, I'll take that.
God created Earth people, but he also created Earth people to hate other Earth people, so there you go.
I literally thought that you were about to say, we did a 2.5-hour episode on Horror Express, so I'm going to consider myself an authority and tell you to shut the fuck up, because now we're talking about the 9th configuration.
That too.
All right, Mr. Brady Bunch.
What about the chalk? Don't worry about it.
I'm going off the deep end here, man.
I mean,
This is so hard to talk about.
it is cohesively. So Cutshaw and Kane have another conversation. They seem to be the through line for this movie, by the way. And they have more conversation about God. And it gets really into both of their faiths. Kane brings up to Cutshaw, if you don't believe in God because of all the evil that happens in the world, why don't you believe in him for all the good things that happen in the world? And then they start talking about how if we're all made of atoms the same as this desk or a pencil, why aren't we all striving toward our own ends and are able to love such as a God would love? That's just a very inspiring conversation that also is in a movie that contains a whole subplot about casting Julius Caesar with dogs.
You know, I'm not sure the argument holds up, though. Because if you presuppose that the world exists as a neutral entity, and God is good and the devil is evil, then that argument holds up perfectly. Because God would influence the good in the world, the devil would influence the evil in the world. But if you presuppose that God, a force of omnipotent benevolence, created the world, then you would have to presuppose that the world is good. And therefore the presence of evil would disprove God, but the presence of good would not merit him. It would be expected. Right?
I would say the character is more... Is it about does God exist? Yes, but I think it might also be a bit more is God dead? Because this movie is the follow-up to The Exorcist, so we know the devil and demons are real. It's a question of, is God just ignoring everybody and letting all the evil happen? Or is he dead? Or does he not exist and it's just the devil?
Well, I think that depends on what people mean when they say God is dead, because that's a phrase that you hear quite often, but I've never heard it explained. Do they mean that God has abandoned us, or do they mean that we have abandoned God? Or do they mean something else?
I will say this. It's at this moment that I was thinking, in this moment... No, it's in this moment that I was thinking, if this movie were made today, it would, in the wrong hands, be a very terrible God's Not Dead sequel.
I can agree with that, and I also think that in the wrong hands, it could be like a full-on admonition of religion in a weird way, like completely... I guess, bypassing the ultimate point of the film. So I would be quite content for this movie never to be remade. Although I do think that in the right hands, someone could do a better job. Like, no shade. I think this is a great movie, but it's rough. It's real rough around the edges.
The thing that makes this movie so rough is, and you have this issue a lot whenever you have an author directing and also writing the screenplay. Things are a lot more tell, don't show, and unfortunately this is a visual medium. People usually want to see and not be told. So you have a lot of conversations that happen in this story, and there's not really a follow-through plot or too much action outside of what we consider to be the third act of the film.
That is so. Show don't tell is almost universally good advice for any medium, but I think that may be, for me, perhaps the most frustrating thing about visual media. So if we look at a book, like let's say The Inheritance Cycle, if we spend 3 enormous novels talking about King Galbatorix and like how evil he is and how powerful he is, that just makes you really want to see him, and that just like builds and builds and builds. Harry Potter with Voldemort, or A Song of Ice and Fire with someone like Tywin Lannister, right? Like, the more you hear about someone in a book, the cooler they get. When you transfer that into a visual medium, if you keep talking about someone that the audience doesn't see, it is just frustrating. Because in a visual medium, if the audience doesn't see them, they don't exist. And I don't know to what extent I'm comfortable with that being true, but it does seem to be true, and it's very frustrating. Because I can see that this was probably an amazing book.
Yes, and again, it's really not the same, because there isn't a physical manifestation of any of the things they're talking about in here. The best you could sum it up is the dream that Cain is having where the man's on the moon and then there's the crucifixion. That's pretty much the movie right there in an avant-garde kind of way. But you take something like the Stranger Things franchise and TV show. You have the big bad, but the only way to properly do it in a show, don't tell medium, is you just expose small parts of the entity at a time, and it just keeps running up the ladder. That way you, or running up that hill, I should say. To be, you just go up the pyramid, and while the number of threat gets smaller, the power of the entity becomes greater. And having an unreliable crew of main characters who aren't equipped and don't know who this main bad is, it makes for an interesting watch just to see the smaller pieces form the whole. But putting it into just a single entity like a Voldemort, or even if you go into Stephen King territory and do like a Randall Flagg, it just becomes silly.
Do you propose that potentially as a way to solve the problem that I brought up with books versus films? Or if not, do you have a proposed solution maybe?
I think that would be my proposed solution. If you do the Hunger Games, I probably wouldn't introduce President Snow right away. I would just keep it to the Capitol, maybe make the main bad some sort of general for the army or Capitol Guard, something like that, or even just make the first movie the Capitol Guards themselves as an entity, sort of like, okay, imagine Star Wars where the first one's just stormtroopers, no Darth Vader. So you don't get to see that big bad, and just interspersed you hear stories of how terrible Darth Vader is. And then the next one you can do just this really evil general that's affecting this planet and these characters. Disney Plus, you're welcome to these ideas, just write me a fucking check.
And show him how to write a check as well.
Yeah, show me how to write a check. I can endorse a check. I just can't write one. And partly because I'm Jewish. But just doing parts of the machine and then zooming out to the whole is probably the best way to do it. And that's any successful television franchise or movie franchise, that's usually how they've had to do it. Think about Alien in Aliens. You get the chest bursters, you get the face huggers, You get the xenomorph at the end, and then in the second one you get the mama xenomorph.
So it's interesting that you brought up Star Wars, because one could argue that Star Wars did do this, right? We have Darth Vader in the first movie, but we don't get to see the Emperor until the second one. But still, in the first movie, you have
mean
this...
old Lightning Hands?
Yes,
old Lightning Hands, his dumbass.
But still, in the first movie, we have this personification of the Empire, which would be very different from, like you said, if in the Hunger Games it's just the Peacekeepers. But I noticed in all of the examples that you gave, these were series. None of these were self-contained to one movie. So if we had a movie like The Ninth Configuration, say, how does one express that idea slowly in a way that the audience still recognizes it?
All right, if you want me to pin it down to a singular work, sorry, I'm looking at my bookshelf currently.
Sorry, I know this is a very difficult question that I'm posing to you.
You have Salem's Lot by Stephen King. General plot of the story is a whole town is being overrun and being turned into vampires. The original big bad of the story are these people being turned into vampires. And then in Act 2, we kind of come to understand that it is Stryker, who is a partner of the vampire, Barlow. But we don't see Barlow really until the third act. And he is the big bad. So it works for both a literary and visual medium that is the core threat. Because it works for every act. Every act you semi-resolve what that conflict is, but you also carry it over into the next act, so that you can have the grand finale where all three must be defeated.
See, I find that if you get it... If the progression looks too much like a staircase, that it starts to frustrate me, though. Like, this is something that I see in TV series a lot. Like, if you look at Burn Notice as an example, okay, one of the first big bads is going to be the guy who burned Michael, but then it's going to be the guy who gave the order to burn Michael. And then, like, every single time we defeat one big bad, like, there's just a new big bad who was, in air quotes, there the whole time. But now we're just now dealing with him. I find that to be very frustrating, more so than entertaining, because it feels so hokey. Like, even Avatar: The Last Airbender sort of kind of did that with Azula, where it was like, okay, Zuko is no longer going to be the big bad, so let's just introduce, and now he has a sister that we've literally never heard of.
I understand that as well. Basically, the best way to implement it is in a story system where there isn't an inherent bureaucracy. Because if it's just, our bad guy is Mike, and then next season it's, our bad guy is Mike's assistant supervisor, and then the next one is Mike's district supervisor.
You know what I'd really love to see is like a really long franchise of horror movies, kind of like Nightmare on Elm Street, where it just keeps going. And then toward the very end, you start going through the bureaucracy of the people who make the movies. Like, they start being the villains because they keep making movies, and they keep putting these characters through this horrible shit. And it eventually becomes like a Cabin in the Woods scenario where they're fighting against the director of the movie.
Okay, you literally just described Wes Craven's New Nightmare.
I've not seen it.
Ooh, not gonna say anything.
Okay, I'll need to watch that then.
So, basically the loose plot of it is, and I'll take any chance to talk about Nightmare on Elm Street because it's literally my favorite. The character... They've stopped making Nightmare on Elm Street movies, and the demon that was encapsulated as Freddy Krueger is now attacking the real world, the people that made the first movie, the actors and directors and producers themselves.
So I literally did just describe that?
Yes.
Without having seen it. Okay, that's amazing. I'm glad they had that idea, because I think it's a good idea. I'll have to go see that now.
A lot of people don't necessarily like it too much because it's too much of a departure, but in my opinion, it's my favorite one of the franchise, just because it's cool to think, okay, the first Nightmare on Elm Street, well, all the movies exist, but it's primarily the first one that they go off of. The first Nightmare on Elm Street movie exists, and the main actress of it now has to fight the demon that's taken the possession of Freddy Krueger, because the films have stopped being made, so the demon of Freddy Krueger has to jump out into our reality. Unless another movie is made to encapsulate him.
They make a Colonel Sanders joke at one point, like, "Oh, is he the guy who makes the chicken?" Mm-hmm. Which is weird because Cane's is also a chicken place. Mm-hmm. I know it's spelled with a C instead of a K, but was that like a double dipping joke? Was Cane's around? It was. Okay,
it's more of an extra crispy joke.
Baton Rouge.
It was a finger-licking joke. Oh, no, it wasn't. Never mind.
No, it wasn't. Get Groper out of here. I was
trying to make a pun. Went into the air, crashed and burned.
Yep, just like...
Goose.
No, just like... Fuck, I've forgotten his name. I'm about to say Chuck Saw. Shut Claw. Cut Saw. No, it was not.
Bone Saw.
Cut Shaw.
Bonesaw from the first Spider-Man movie. You ain't going nowhere.
Cut Shaw. Just like Cut Shaw was going to do.
Yeah, I don't feel bad. My notes, I wrote him down as Crenshaw.
Fucking Chickasaw.
Part Cherokee, part Choctaw. They all, so back to our conversation with Kane and Cutshaw. They start talking about suicide because they're talking about being able to love as God would love and being able to sacrifice in that, and how love is the purest example of the existence of God. And Cutshaw basically asks him parameters on that, and he brings up the analogy of someone in the military jumping on a live grenade to save the rest of them. And Cutshaw basically says that's suicide. And Kane says suicide and giving up your life are not the same. And he says the essence of suicide is despair. Crenshaw asks Kane to give him an example that he knew, and he couldn't give an example that he knew directly. And the end of this scene is basically Cutshaw asking Kane to take him to church. To which he shows up in this really weird... I don't want to say... Is it like a child's outfit?
I'm not entirely certain.
It's like a child with a giant bow. Really weird. But he says, would Foot be mad if I wore this to church? Or mass is what he says. And after mass, the aftermath of all this, the aftermath of this is Cutshaw asking Kane that if he dies first, would he give him a sign that there's a God? And he said he'd try. And that's pretty much the most important part of that.
Well, a sign that there's an afterlife in general.
Yes.
Especially.
And it's when they get back from Mass that Kane sees someone who he recognizes when he was Killer Kane. And we get this shot of the guy telling him to back down from wherever he was back in Vietnam, and it's raining, and Kane is holding a head that he cut off of presumably a little boy who wouldn't be quiet. Kane passes out, and it's here that we're given the explanation of what the twist is, where orders accidentally came through that Kane was a psychologist and he had to go to the place where he's at now. And through that, the psychosis developed that he was a separate person from this Kane individual. And they just decided to run with it and just make an experiment out of it to hopefully crack the case of what's going on with Cutshaw. or the whole experiment, the experiment as a whole, of why these people who were facing this trauma and going presumably insane when they're
Which all of
seeing
this
more.
just seems horribly, horribly unethical, or at the very least, very dangerous.
Oh yeah, yeah. But it's the military; they can do whatever they want.
I cannot fathom this getting greenlit.
Someone who is clearly mentally unstable, who has committed war atrocities, but because it's for our side, who gives a shit?
I'm just. These men are all in the military, are they not?
Yes.
Like, so these are men who are like trained to kill, and are now all expressing erratic, manic behavior, and they've all just been given free reign of this damn castle. Like they're just walking around wherever they want at all times of the day and night, and then they're putting an incredibly proficient killer who is now suffering from a psychosis in charge. Now, look, my confidence in government and military programs, from personal experience, is not particularly high. But this seems too reckless. It beggars belief.
Yeah. I mean, it's very problematic. Let's say that. There's a lot of issues you can see, and throughout the movie, watching it a second time, you see all the times Dr. Fell has advocated for this. In fact, he had to go to Washington at one point in the story to advocate for this, which I still don't know how it got greenlit.
It didn't get greenlit, it got gaslit.
It got gaslit into happening, pretty much. But Fell tells everybody who's in the know on this little experiment that the only way to break Kane from this is because he feels bad about all the people he's killed. He has to do something that's a redemptive act to wipe away the guilt from killing all the people, and that's going to come from saving the patients from themselves. And it's at this time that Cutshaw steals a car and breaks from the facility.
Do we know why he did this?
I think... I'd say it's because he's already kind of dealing with some issues. Him coming to Kane and saying if he dies first, would he provide some proof that there's an afterlife, does kind of exhibit him dealing with some of his issues. He's at least
and also asking to go to mass.
Yes, so he's taking at least some form of steps toward resolving his existential issues. So it's at this time Kane goes to save him, unbeknownst to the doctor, and they're at this dive bar with these bikers. In I get the scene is cool, but to me it goes on way too long.
The entire scene in the bar?
Yes.
See, this entire film up to this point has been so heavy on dialogue and existential themes and so light on action that I'll forgive it. This is at a superficial level the most exciting part of the movie. So I think it was warranted that it went on a bit long.
Yeah, I mean, we go from having these conversations about is there a God, is God afoot, is the moon cheese, did the moon fuck someone's sister, to Cutshaw almost being forced to suck a biker dick.
Yes.
A burned biker dick.
So I actually really liked this entire sequence. First of all, since you
the burnt biker almost forcing fellatio on Cutshaw.
Yes, and I'll explain why. It's actually
Okay.
really important. But first of all, since you brought up the Man on the Moon again, it would have been amazing if this was a DreamWorks movie, and like the beginning of it was the dude fishing like on the moon, and then he just whips out his dick. Like that would have been a great intro.
You can't see me, but I have a deer in the headlights look, audience.
Yeah, no. That means that I've succeeded.
Okay, so what about? I thought
DreamWorks.
where you were going with this was it was just like a crucified Jesus on the moon, and he throws out the fishing pole.
No.
Oh,
No, I mean that would have been good too, I guess. But I mean, his hands are kind of occupied.
it's all in the wrist.
Anyway, I mean that the same is true for the DreamWorks guy. So what happens in this bar scene is that it seems to be a gang of some kind, and when I say gang, I don't just mean like just people who bike together. Like they seem to be fucked up. And they notice that Cutshaw is who he is, that he is this failed astronaut, and they seem to believe that he has disgraced the uniform in some way, and they start harassing him. And they're like tying him up and pouring alcohol over him and punching him. It's very abusive, and like the whole bar seems to be totally fine with it. Like there's a handful of people who are like trying to get a hold of the asylum and whatnot, but for the most part, like everybody is just piling in on this guy. And it's really depressing. Like these people all kind of need to be put to death. And then eventually, Colonel Kane shows up alone, by the way, to come and rescue Cutshaw. Are you all right, Dylan? You are staring just like blankly at the wall.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, are you
No,
sure?
I was listening.
Okay. So, yeah, alone, which is very strange. Maybe I missed something. And he comes to rescue them.
He escaped
And
because
he escaped.
Yeah. He's supposed to be under supervision at all times. That's why he can't leave. But he heard that Cutshaw had left, so he took it upon himself to find him because he still thinks he's a doctor.
Okay. And then, as Kane is attempting to rescue Cutshaw, the leader of this biker gang keeps making requests of him, like, say that Marines are chicken, say that the Marines suck, do this, do that, here, he, like, shoves him to the ground and, like, makes him drink alcohol off the floor, and things like that. And he just keeps doing these progressively humiliating things. And when you mentioned the, like, attempted rape scene, I mentioned that I really like that, it's because at no point was Kane's character ever willing to sacrifice other people's lives for his pride. Right? Mm-hmm. It was not a situation where somebody bumps into you at a bar and you like turn around and go, "Hey, watch where you're going." Right? Or like somebody makes a comment about, in air quotes, your woman, and so you feel the need to defend her honor or something like that. This is not what this was about. He was willing to suffer any amount of humiliation in order to preserve life. Because the audience knows that this guy eventually is going to fuck up every person in this bar. Like, you can tell. But he doesn't do it for his pride. He says Marines are chicken. He says Marines suck. He drinks the beer off of the floor. He does all of it. And it's only when Cutshaw is about to be raped that he finally decides, no, I have to step in and do something. I have to save this person. And then he goes into Hulk mode and, like, kind of brings out the Killer Kane within him. And he kills basically everybody in the bar, or severely injures them at least. And in case I haven't made it clear by now, the reason I like that is because if he had gone into Berserk mode for anything less than Cutshaw's life being in danger...
oral virginity?
/ oral virginity, yes. Like if there had not been a serious crime about to occur... And Kane went berserk, then it would have not felt warranted. It would have felt like a betrayal of his character. And in a more general sense, I think that this is a good lesson for a lot of people, right? Like, if somebody insults you and you just take it and walk away and everybody goes home safe, you're a bigger man than somebody who turns around and starts a fight.
That's a really good point. I would also like to point out, on probably a lighter note, Now, this biker gang's awful gay for people with swastikas on their jackets.
What do you mean?
Well, one's forcing his dick down an astronaut's throat. The other is wearing an insane amount of, well, doing a very failed attempt at a cat wing, a cat eye, or a smoky eye.
Now, Dylan, it has been a long established precedent since before the Romans that it's only gay if you're receiving.
Ah.
I mean, you know, The Sopranos established this as well.
Okay. Didn't know this.
Would you like to protest that?
I mean, I could, because my partner's not straight.
No, I mean, you understand that, like, that is a legitimate, like, stigma, right?
No,
Or,
no, but now
you didn't
I
know
get
that?
it. No.
Yeah. Like in ancient
Sorry, I'm just dealing with my
civilizations.
worldview being shattered right now.
Legitimately, like in
My
ancient
possibilities are
civilizations.
opening up before my eyes.
If you gave it to another man, that was considered masculine. But if you took it from another man, that was considered weak.
That just seems a bit.
What, hypocritical?
No, I was just gonna say, I feel like all the men who were giving just made that a mutual agreement.
I mean, yeah.
To preserve their own. What?
I mean, there is an amount of logic to it. I mean, all people have mouths and asses, but only men have dicks, right? So, if you're having sex with a mouth or an anus, then you know you could pretend it's a woman's. You can't really pretend that it's a woman's dick.
In 2022, you can.
Yeah, but in 2022, you can do a lot of things. They did not have access to this technology in a castle in 1980.
The future. A castle in 1980.
That's a weird sentence.
That honestly needs to be a thing. You needed the castle with the fog, and then lightning striking it, and playing old music, and then it just says 1980.
Oh, I want to see that. Which, I really love the way that the leader of this biker gang looks, by the way. He is just so interesting to look at. Mm-hmm. His face looks really swollen, and he kind of looks like he would be the leader of some kind of rock or metal band, like Kiss or something. And he's just got the faintest bit of, like, mascara and some eyeshadow, and he really, really looks like the main character of his own story. And he's even featured as, like, the main villain of the movie in the posters. Because there are some lovely posters of him with his knife, like, as the focal point of the image.
Rewatching this movie, I kind of understood where they got the horror theme from. Just a little bit. In that, if you compare this to a movie like Carrie, Stephen King's Carrie, they kind of have a similar structure. In that all the violence happens directly in the third act and is kind of its own vignetted sequence. And up until now, there's just creepy music in random places. But on the whole, it's not really a scary story. And all of the violence is bore out of humiliation. So I think if we're gonna, that might have been where the critics were thinking, and the film boards were going. Because if you're gonna classify Carrie as a horror story, you kinda can classify this in the same regard, just in that sense alone.
I suppose so, and you know,
'Cause
I said
never
somewhat.
thought Carrie was a horror story, because it's really not. If you just watch that, skip the prom scene where the blood comes on, it's a pretty decent movie.
Well, I said somewhat facetiously that the biker gang leader was on the center of the poster, like he was the main villain. But on a more serious note, I believe that he is the main villain of the story, because he and that entire bar represent, they're a representation of like the callousness and the passivity and the evil that is in the world, right? This entire group of people who are going to like humiliate you and beat you up and rape you, and you know, it's like 3 or 4 people that are doing it, and like everybody else is just sitting around watching, not doing anything. Like this is the exact kind of evil that Cutshaw and Kane are talking about existing in the world and potentially disproving God, right? And the devil doing his commercials. Like, the biker gang leader represents the evil in the world, I believe. And so he deserves his place on that poster.
You make a real good point with that, because up until now, everything's kind of claustrophobic in that everything's in this castle that has all the weird angles, all the religious imagery. Something also that you can point out is whenever they're having scenes in Kane's room, his bed frame, his headboard, has the 3 crosses on it. So just some religious imagery there for you. And it's after Kane has maimed or seriously injured everybody in the biker bar. Which I don't even think is biker bar. They go back to the institution, and the police are there. And they're wanting to take Kane into custody for it, but Kane's in his room. Cutshaw goes in the room with him while the guards and the armed forces kind of contend with the sheriff, allegedly. Something I also want to note real quick is horror veteran Tom Adkins is in this movie as well. And he's just a baby. But I just really love seeing him in here. So at some point we're going to have to watch we're going to end up watching one of his movies just because he's in so many around the 80s, and I have a decent sized blind spot for those movies, so I'm interested in seeing more. I know he was in Halloween 3. And Night of the Creeps, but he did a couple more. So we'll probably check him out at some point. But anyway, Kane and Cutshaw are in Kane's bedroom, and Kane's all wrapped up, and they're having somewhat of a conversation. Kane is kind of out of it, and this conversation ultimately goes to Kane talking about how he's going to show Cutshaw an example of God's existence. And it's kind of solemn, and Cutshaw does reveal to Kane why he was afraid to go to the moon, because that's been a question that's been asked this whole time. Why is he afraid to go to the moon? And he says because it's lonely, and there is just all empty space, and if something were to happen and he couldn't come back, he would die alone, and if there is no God, then he would truly die alone. Which is a really heavy fear when you sit down and think about it, especially if you're going to bed right after you watch this movie and you have time to sit and marinate on these things, like I did. Kind of had to get up, take some NyQuil. I definitely wouldn't recommend. This isn't a movie you watch right before bed, not because it's scary, but because your going to bed thoughts are going to be muddled with existential dread just a bit.
I mean, my going to bed thoughts are always muddled with existential dread, and my waking up thoughts. But I always watch the movies that we review right before bed. I think that it helps me absorb the information better, and also it's always late at night, so I have the proper ambience.
Usually I have to, too, because I work until 11 o'clock at night, so by the time I get home at midnight, I don't really have time. Now, if it's something that's especially moved me, like some of the ice stuff in Horror Express, I'll watch something like Futurama, because I'm watching my way through that, just so I have something happy to watch. Something that's funny, though, that happened to me the other day. I was watching this movie for the podcast for the first time, and it was late at night, and I had some medicine I had to go take, so I go walk down my hallway, and I have a long, dark hallway. And when we initially did the podcast, fun little fact for the listeners, we recorded Carnival of Souls like 40 times. So it's naturally pre-saved to my YouTube. Anytime I pull up a link, it's just anytime I type in YouTube, it's just the link to Carnival of Souls. I was doing something on my phone, put it in my pocket. I pocket dialed that link, and the music started playing, and it was loud because everything's louder at night when everyone's asleep at 2 a.m. It was dark, and I was walking down that hallway, and that music just started, and it was the scene. It was one of the scenes where the ghoul shows himself, and it scared the hell out of me. Like, the hair on my neck stood up. I was honestly really frazzled, and I had this idea in my head of just seeing the ghoul just there in the hallway, and I thought, damn.
That is wonderful.
My heart just kind of stopped there. That was one of the scarier experiences I've had in a hot minute.
So, regarding Cutshaw's fear of dying alone, you mentioned that it's very heavy, and actually, first of all, I just want to mention, I love how you said if something in a film particularly moves you, then you might watch something afterward, and your example was the eyes in Horror Express. Like, I love that you were moved by them, right?
That just gets me. It just the blood and the vacantness of it. No,
makes you want to pour some ketchup on a fried egg, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's just one of the things that spooks me.
But anyway, this fear of dying alone, this is something that's been repeated in a lot of different works, and weirdly enough, Donnie Darko is the one that I'm thinking of at the moment, where Donnie says, there's this quote that every living thing that dies alone, or something like that. Mm-hmm. Is that what it is?
Yeah, I believe so.
I was just wondering if we could talk about the origin of that fear of dying alone, because for some reason I just don't really understand it. Like, I'm not trying to be like too philosophical here, but everybody does die alone. Like, when you die, it's just you. Like, even if somebody's dying next to you, you're dead.
I think it's more of a fear of... Perhaps I'm projecting some things onto this, we'll see. It's more of a fear of having lived an unlived life. Mm-hmm. And by dying alone, also dying unfulfilled.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. And being afraid of, dying up in space. Being a part of NASA, you sacrifice a lot of your personal time to do that. So it's probably not hard to imagine that Cutshaw hasn't developed a family. He hasn't gotten to do a lot of the things he wants to do with his life. Everything's just sort of been a part of the sole mission of going to the moon. So I think that might be what sort of comes together to attribute the fear of not wanting to die alone. Because if you die alone, it's also equatable to dying with nothing to show for what you have.
I can maybe see that, but I mean, this man has gone to the fucking moon, right? Like,
no,
how can you? Well, he's
hasn't
going
gone to the. No, he's not.
Why not?
I don't know, because Reagan said he was going to die up there.
But I mean, okay, so when he's better at the end, the license plate says NASA on it, mm-hmm. or the bumper, not the bumper. One of the stickers on one side of the car. I don't remember which one it is.
The National Ass Sucking Association. That's what
so
that means.
The assumption is that he's back in the program and he will be going to the moon. But the point is, if he goes up to the moon, if he goes up into space and then dies, he could not justify to himself that his life has been unfulfilled. Like, if he has regrets about not having a family, about not dedicating himself to other things, mm-hmm. then that's valid. That's fine. Like, maybe he realized that he didn't really want to do this. Mm-hmm. But if he's just worried about having lived like a fulfilling life, you went to the fucking moon, man. Like, I don't think that that's what it was. I think he really was just afraid of dying alone. which when I was with one of my partners and we began like sleeping in the same bed together, I had a lot of trouble with this because, to me, when you go to sleep, not just when you die, that's something that you do alone. Like in the final minutes of your consciousness, as you're kind of going through what you did that day and you're drifting off into oblivion, that's something that you can only do alone. And so it was very weird and distracting for me to have somebody next to me. And I kind of feel like I feel the same way about dying. Like, it's just... I know a lot of people who need to have people around them 24/7. Like, they remind me of puppies. Like, always running up and trying to hump your leg or something. And to me, that's inappropriate. Like, we're all alone in the end, and that's not depressing. It's just the way it is.
Yeah, but
you
you also
with
have,
it.
whenever you go to sleep versus dying, there's also the power of choice. Whenever you go to sleep, you are choosing to kind of cut yourself out from the rest and be that singular individual apart from everything else and go to sleep. Separate yourself and your consciousness from everything, versus as when you die, it's sort of taken from you. So I can see if you're a people person, the idea of that not being your choice, because he's fully willing to go to space. Like, I mean, you don't go through that much of the program to where we see him where he's being carried away because he's gone insane. You don't go through all that program without that being your choice. But the idea of the choice of whether to separate yourself permanently could be what scares people from that.
I mean, it would be horrifying regardless, knowing that you're going out into that vast expanse, and you can't just, like, spontaneously decide to come back.
Yeah, for me, I feel like it's just, for me, if I were in space, I would just probably get real homesick. I would get a sense of claustrophobia of this isn't a space where I'm meant to be, and I suddenly don't feel comfortable there. Sort of like... I've done some very amateur scuba diving before, and it took a long time to learn how to breathe through the thing, because it's just something you don't think about. You think you can just breathe, but your body, there is a little bit of your body that fights that, because your body says you don't breathe underwater. So actually mentally forcing yourself and telling yourself it's okay to breathe underwater is actually a bit of a hurdle a lot of people who do that sort of thing have.
Well, anytime there's some form of threshold that you have to throw yourself over, it's difficult. Like, you brought up scuba diving, and rock climbing is another example, or any kind of climbing or rappelling. Like, when you are in a high place, it's very hard to jump off. Even if you have a line that's connected to you, right? And you know that you're just going to slowly glide down to the bottom. That the ability to let go is just astonishingly difficult the first few times you have to do it, because your like entire body's screaming, "No, don't let go." Or
bungee jumping.
Yeah, or bungee jumping. Yeah. Which I haven't been bungee jumping arguably ever. The last time I was bungee jumping was just like in a mall. But that was ages ago.
Okay, I have a bit of an irrational fear of bungee jumping, but that's just because the movie Joe Dirt had it, where they hooked him up to a bungee cord when he was going to kill himself, and then he hit his head on the top of the bridge. I know that doesn't work out scientifically at all, but it's still a fear I have. Oh, God. Well, we should probably get back to what's left of this story.
Well, which we're basically done. I mean, we talked about him committing suicide, did we not?
Actually, we didn't.
I'm pretty sure. Okay. Well, let's talk about that then.
So, Kane is real out of it. They have this whole conversation about, well, really, Cutshaw talks about why he's afraid to go to the moon, and he just leaves Kane after he says he's going to show them that there is a God and the existence of God. And Kane, Cutshaw leaves. Kane is laying there, and we as the audience see that under his blanket falls a bloody knife, and his hand is bloody as well. Cutshot is sitting at the stairway, and he's just thinking of things, and he rubs his boot for some reason, and there's blood on it, which tells him that Kane has tried to kill himself. And we remember the conversation he had about giving up your life versus suicide. And also, when Kane and Cutshot are having the conversation, Kane is talking also about shock treatment. And so Kane has killed himself. Everybody sees this. And it's here, presumably, we get a jump forward in time to, I guess... they don't really disclose how much time it is, but it's sunny, it's beautiful, the castle is beautiful, whereas before it was always rain and fog, which is another interesting thing this movie does. It plays with the weather, just like we were talking about in an earlier episode, Tenebrae. And Cutshot is brought back there for some reason, and he reads a letter from Kane that says, here's your pretty much, you were looking for existence in a god, here's your reason. And he goes into the castle, and we see that it's completely empty. So presumably everybody who had those issues were cured. Now there is apparently a 4-hour cut of the movie initially, where we have more interaction with all the other people in the ward. So, to just make an example of all the lives that Kane did touch and ultimately fulfilled with this act of shock therapy. And I think now is a good time to talk about the biblical allusions to this, of the one man who sacrifices himself for the turmoil of others.
Martin Luther King.
You meant
Jesus.
The 99 Thesis guy?
No. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, obviously the religious allegories with somebody.
The 99 Theses guy, yeah.
Sacrificing himself. I mean, I believe at one point one of the characters even refers to Cain as a lamb.
Yes.
Thinking maybe it was Cutshot at the end.
Cutshot says he was a lamb, so he was a sacrifice.
Yes.
And through that they get the Sandy back. And it also doesn't help that, again, Cain's bed had the 3 crosses on it.
I think the main question that I have about this ending is, what specifically is the reason that he killed himself? Because they talk about the example of the grenade, right? Like a soldier jumping onto a grenade to save his comrades. That is an immediate act of self-sacrifice without which others would have died, right? That decision was forced upon him in that moment, and he chose to sacrifice himself to save others. What exactly is Cain sacrificing himself for?
I think that also gets into an issue of how much of everything that's been going on was a psychosis. How much of it was Cain with a split personality, and how much of it was Cain as Killer Cain. Was the whole thing Killer Cain, and this was just him creating a redemption for himself, and just all of the people at the asylum playing along with something that they themselves just impressed upon him, thinking, oh, this guy's developed a split personality, let's play into it. And he was like, okay, I'll play into you playing into my split personality that I made up. That's ultimately where this starts, and the whole time he needed to perform a redemptive act. And obviously, war is different than civilian life. So him killing a bunch of civilians, he's going to jail, possibly prison. So if he was going to help these people, he was sort of at the 11th hour to do it.
I suppose so. I guess I still have that same problem of, he already did the the act of saving Cutshaw in the bar.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I just have too vindictive of a personality, but I don't really see the harming of those people in that bar to be in any way a negative act. I know that Kane himself probably disagrees with me, but like you shouldn't feel bad about that.
Yeah, I don't think he does. I think it's just the fact that his original mission was to help the men at the asylum, and since he's going to jail, that's going to pose a great threat to him being able to do that.
Yes. However, the importance of the self-sacrifice comes in what are you sacrificing yourself for, right? Like it's not just enough for the martyr to say, "Oh, I'm going to kill myself for this," right? Like I could like go out in public right now and be like, "I am killing myself in the name of animal rights," and then just like cut my throat open, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean anything. Right, I'm not accomplishing anything. How would the inmates look at Kane killing himself for apparently no reason and say, "Oh, now you have redeemed me, right? You have shocked me into an awakening."
I think again in the novel you get a lot of him working with the people, and you probably get a lot more of their opinions on him as a person, because he really does seem to be more. He doesn't impose any sort of methodology on these patients. He more or less just listens to them and gains enough of their viewpoint and understanding of the world and projects off of that to get a result. So naturally, he's going to be close with them because he can himself navigate their mindset, and people just naturally gravitate toward people who share a similar mindset. So someone getting that close to them and then killing themselves, that would probably be enough to shock someone back into something, given the right circumstances and conditions maybe. And if you're one of the ones who are faking, it might be enough to say, okay, we need to stop this.
So you're saying that it is simply the suicide of a loved one, in air quotes, or someone close to you, that shocked them back into reality, regardless of what that death was intrinsically for.
Yes.
I can see that maybe.
Or, let's look at a more realistic approach. That whole place got shut down and everybody got relocated because they let someone who was a member of the asylum run the asylum.
And then they committed suicide after killing an entire bar full of people.
Yes, so the whole project just went tits up.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people in that situation probably got put in jail, right?
Yeah, put in jail, board licenses revoked.
Oh, yeah.
Dishonorable discharges. But the movie kind of puts a little cherry on top with him being with Cutshaw getting into the taxi, and he says, let me find it here. Where did the St. Christopher medal come from? And the cabbie is like, what St. Christopher medal? And the movie just kind of ends, which I had to Google it. St. Christopher is the patron saint of travelers. So if he's going to the moon, that's good for him to have.
Which this medal implies, by the way, that Colonel Kane came through on his promise and gave him proof of the afterlife.
I think that part was more ham-fisted than him just sacrificing himself. I feel like the show of the godly love that they spoke about earlier was a better example of that. But then again, this is also a movie that exists in the same universe as The Exorcist, so this could 100% just be a literal thing that happened.
I think that for a movie that had this much chaos in it, the ending should have been a little more concise. Like
concise?
Yeah, so...
Okay, here's the thing. When... Concise how? If you... what... This movie just threw a bunch of things at nothing. So really everything just landed on a pile.
Well, like I said, we had this sort of semi-lengthy discussion about what exactly Cain's sacrifice meant, what it was for,
Right.
and how it would have cured the patients. I feel like that after suffering through so much of the chaos and the craziness that was the first half to the first 3/4 of this movie, that the payoff should have been clearer, right? I should have been asking myself for 75% of the movie, what does this all mean? And then at the end, I should have not necessarily gotten a definitive answer, but gotten close enough to a definitive answer that the payoff felt worth it. Instead, I'm sitting here asking myself what the ending meant as well, which means that I'm asking myself what the entire movie meant, which means that I'm still scratching my head thinking about Fritos.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I get it. I
Okay.
think this movie mostly focused itself on the more biblical... Sorry. This movie focused itself on the more biblical allusions to the character of Cain. And that's really, if you want to put a pin in it, the crux of the story, especially in the grand scheme of this trilogy of stories that this author was telling. One is not a question. One is a question of faith. One is existential dread, and the other is existential dread in relation to your faith. And then the third one, I believe, is... I don't even remember the third Exorcist movie. It's been so long. I remember I liked it a lot, though.
Legion?
But, yes. I don't know. I think you can't get caught up with this series, I guess, if you think about faith as being a real thing. That's not the sole important authorial motivation. He's not trying to prove or tell a faith-based story. He's writing a story and creating a story around the dynamics of religion and what those do, and humanistic systems of belief.
Do you think that there's any significance to his name being Cain?
Well, I mean, at the end he tried to raise Cain, but he wasn't able. And perhaps...
Congratulations. I guess there's probably at least one person listening to this that hasn't heard that joke before.
Yeah.
No, but seriously, I mean, obviously it's not spelled the same, but for a movie with such heavy religious connotations, I find it hard to believe that was a coincidence. Well, with Cain being the guy who is kind of cast out for killing his fellow men, and my brother's keeper.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a parallel there. I don't know. The movie as a whole was just... I don't want to say it was a confusing mess, because it was very intentional about what it was presenting. As we've covered movies on this podcast where you could tell either the director, the writer, or the production just didn't allow for certain things to be cohesive. I feel like this movie is 100% as cohesive as it wanted to be.
This movie is what it wanted to be.
Yes, this movie is operating at 100% of its capability. There is no questioning why the author did this because they didn't explain it. Any questions you have about this story are presented there intentionally. But to answer your question, I'm not 100% sure on any other relevance to Cain outside of being the source of original sin. That's what the third one did.
That's what
original sin.
Original sin, because they discuss original sin many times.
Yes.
In this film. Okay, that makes sense now.
Original sin.
Being in general like the animosity of man toward his fellow man. which is represented many times over in this film. Okay, I am kind of ashamed of myself for not realizing that sooner.
All right, so I think we're at the point in our story, not our story, our show, where we just wrap up our final thoughts. Jacob, what do you have for us? What do you have after going through the movie, going through the characters, going through these themes? What is your final thoughts on the matter?
I wish that I could find a way to articulately describe the different kinds of good movies that exist. Because my litmus test for that is generally, if I have a guest over and I want them to have a good time and I want to impress them, and it's somebody that I would invite over, right? It's not somebody who's just going to want to, like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Somebody with decent taste. And I'm going to show them a movie, then that's one litmus test for that, right? It's like, okay, this is something good enough that I feel comfortable recommending it to someone and watching it with them, and they will have a good time. That is not this movie.
It's very divisive.
Honestly, even though I enjoyed this movie a lot, it was extremely hard to pay attention to. Because it was just so constantly in your face. It was so constantly filled with just, like, ridiculous lines and nonsensical conversations. And it doesn't, there's not a lot of action. It doesn't really follow much of a structure. It really is just all over the place. And yet, it is definitely a good movie by some definition. Like, I am very glad to have watched it. And I would like it if most of the people that I knew had also watched it, because I would like to talk to them about it. I would like to have their opinions on it. I would like for them to have lived the experience of watching it and thinking about these topics. But I'm not going to make a bowl of popcorn and invite some people over to watch this.
It's not a popcorn movie.
No.
Like I
It's
said,
almost...
it's a movie that requires a moderate amount of mastication.
Yeah. And possibly even masochism. I don't know. I guess I would almost equate it to required reading, right?
You really could do a bait and switch with this movie. Just say you're having a horror movie night and then just watch all three of these exorcism movies. And it's just the sandwich. We're going to watch the Exorcist movies, and it's just there. We're watching 2 hours of just existential drama.
I want to invite some people over to watch some movies, and, like, they're all sitting on the couch looking at the TV, and I set up, like, a lawn chair next to the TV, and I watch them the whole time, eating popcorn.
That's essentially what podcasts are.
That scared them.
Oh gosh. Yeah, as far as this movie goes, the poster made it seem like it was going to be a lot more of a standard horror film, and it wasn't, so that really caught me off guard. I'm with you. I'm very glad I watched it, and I did enjoy it, especially on a second view. It was still a bit more to digest, and I found myself, especially during the bar scene, I found myself wanting to fast forward. But on the whole, I really liked the themes and discussions, and hearing how all, at first, the insane jargon and rambling were actually making sense the more you knew these characters and understanding what they're doing and what their motivations are. I thought that was really interesting. But in the context of this show, as Deep Cuts of Horror, it's probably not something which my litmus test for this show is, am I going to reach for it in October when I'm wanting to watch something spooky? Probably going to say not. This movie was more, Mom said she's making mac and cheese, but there's broccoli in it.
I cannot in any way
and
explain why that makes as much sense as it does. That made perfect sense, and I have no idea why.
Alright, so do you have anything else to add?
No,
Nope.
I think that about sums it up. I'm sure that I'm going to be standing in the shower or sitting in the shower like 2 or 3 hours from now, and I'm going to think, damn it, I wish I'd talked about that. The cross didn't make any sense. Aliens are Satanists.
The cross didn't make sense because the moon didn't exist then.
And I'm never going to look at a bag of Fritos the same.
Alright, so now we're in the part of the episode where we decide if a movie is deep or if it should be cut. Deep meaning we think you'd like it and enjoy it. Cut meaning you should probably just skip it in your queue and go on to something else. Jacob, as always, I'm going to open the floor up to you. Is this movie deep or does it need to be cut?
I don't think that anybody could justify claiming that this movie is not deep.
Yes.
This movie is definitely deep. The question is just whether whether that means I'm recommending you watch it as a horror movie.
Yes, that's what I was going to get into. I know sometimes we have some debate on this, but I think for this movie, especially and in particular, it's best if we don't put this movie into the deep category because it's not deep or it doesn't have meaning. This, I think we're just going to set up on a basis of deep being a good horror movie or cut meaning you should probably skip it if you're not wanting a good horror movie.
I mean, it's not a good horror movie. Because I genuinely don't believe it's a horror movie.
Yeah.
But it is a good movie.
It's
just understand what you're getting yourself into.
Yes. I'm going to echo that because on the one hand, it is deep. The themes they deal with are deep. The conversations they have are very deep and thought-provoking. There's an insane amount of humorous material in it. Any horror that you can derive from it is all existential and stuff that you as the audience actually have to marinate on yourself. Break it apart and listen to it and think about it and think about what these characters are thinking and feeling and putting yourself in their shoes. That's the only way you're really going to derive any horror out of it.
I would say if you treat this like The Truman Show, you'll probably... Just imagine that whatever genre The Truman Show is, the ninth configuration is in that same category.
Okay, yeah. Yes. Because it's not a comedy. It's not really a drama. The idea of it is horrifying, but that's about it.
It's not a scary movie.
No.
The idea is horrifying, but it's not scary.
I think that's the thing, too, is watching this movie, the marketing made me think it was a scary movie, so when it actually started and got going, it required a bit more of my thought muscles. Required a bit more thought muscle to digest and figure out what it was. A lot like The Truman Show, because Truman Show, since it had Jim Carrey in the lead, they marketed it as a comedy and showed some of the funnier aspects of it. And then when people got out of the movie, they really weren't sure what to think about it.
Mm.
But for this movie, I do recommend people see it. It's not the most boring thing I've had to watch or get through. I enjoyed seeing it, and I'm glad I did see it. But I'm going to say the movie, just as a horror movie, needs to be cut.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, not a horror movie.
I think this is the first time we've had a double agreement on a movie being cut.
Well, that's because you kind of gave a very strict definition of what the deep versus cut meant, and you knew ahead of time like how I felt about it being a horror movie. So.
Oh yeah, but how else would you rate this?
No, I agree with the rating. I'm just saying it's not a miraculous coincidence that we both agree it should be cut. When we both sat here talking for 2.5 hours about how it's not a horror movie, and you say, okay, deep means it's a horror movie.
I mean, that's just kind of, for this, that's kind of the context you have to follow, because it's definitely a deep movie, but it doesn't have really any horror themes. Like 2001: A Space Odyssey, even though that has more horror themes than this movie does. Even though this has some reminiscent scenes. Really, the only actual horror aspect is the bar scene, and you could say the dream scene with Jesus on the moon.
I would say Jesus on the moon more so than the biker gang, which, by the way, that's a fabulous phrase. But because honestly, that whole biker bar scene could have just been taken from The Incredible Hulk or something, right? Like,
right.
Seeing a guy beat up a bunch of bikers is not the sole domain of horror.
Watch Roadhouse. Do you have anything else to add before the episode ends?
No, that sums it up. Like I said, I will have shower thoughts later.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening. That was our show. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, go ahead, give us a 5-star review, and also give us a rating. Give us a good rating. Let us know what you liked about the show. Let us know what you thought about it. See what you'd like us to review next time. You can also follow us and catch up on what we're doing at deepcutsofhorror@gmail.com, which is where you can email us, or you can follow us on all our social medias at Twitter and Instagram at Deep Horror Pod. Again, that is at Deep Horror Pod, and keep following us for more content. Thank you, everybody, and stay spooky.